Hello everyone, and welcome to or back to the channel. I'm Origin Gaming, and in this video we're going to be covering the book of 2 Samuel. 2 Samuel begins right where 1 Samuel left off. In fact, in the original Hebrew canon, it was just the book of Samuel. This is also the case for the books of Kings and Chronicles, but when the Septuagint translation of the Hebrew Bible was made, Samuel, Kings, and Chronicles were all split into two parts because of their length. But the split wasn't made arbitrarily down the middle of Samuel as to make two books of equal length, as 1 Samuel is a decent bit longer than 2 Samuel. Instead, the Septuagint translators chose to split right after Saul's death. This puts even more focus on Saul's death as the turning point of the story, allowing David to then rise to the throne. After the death of Saul, and when David had returned to Ziklag from defeating the Amalekites, 2 days passed, but on the third day, an Amalekite came to David's camp and informed him that Saul and his son Jonathan were dead. David questioned the man as to how he knew for sure that Saul and Jonathan were dead, to which he responded that he was there when Saul was gravely wounded and leaning on his spear, and that Saul had asked him to finish him off so that he no longer had to feel his anguish, and that he had done so, and that he had brought the armlet and the crown of Saul to give to his lord David. The Amalekite explains that what he did was an act of mercy, as there was no way that Saul would have survived his wounds anyways. But David does not see it that way, and he has the Amalekite executed because he says that he has killed the Lord's anointed. Even after all that had happened, David's loyalty for Saul was still so strong that he struck down this Amalekite, who had only done what Saul had requested by putting him out of his misery. The rest of the chapter then consists of a lamentation that is said to come directly from the book of Jashar. The book of Jashar was also mentioned back in Joshua chapter 10, which told the story of the Lord stopping the sun in the sky so that Joshua could defeat the enemies that were attacking Gibeon. While the book of Jashar itself has been lost to time, both the instance we see in Joshua and here in 2 Samuel refer to important battles in Israel's history in a poetic form. For this reason, there's a decent chance that the book of Jashar was a collection of battle poems that was consulted as one of the sources when the book of Joshua and Samuel was being put together. But ultimately, we can't know for sure unless archaeology uncovers a genuine manuscript of the Book of Jashar, of which there has not been any yet. So if you see anybody who's claiming to have the Book of Jashar, know that that is a forgery. The lamentation goes on to praise Saul and Jonathan, comparing them to the swiftness of eagles and the strength of lions, lamenting at how the mighty have fallen. David laments specifically that the Philistines would find out about the deaths of Saul and Jonathan, saying that they would rejoice in their streets. This fear that David had is exactly what's described in chapter 31 of 1 Samuel. When the Philistines confirm that they have killed Saul, they send messengers all around their lands to preach the good news that Saul has been killed. After David had finished mourning for Saul and Jonathan's loss, he asked God if he should go up to the cities of Judah, to which the Lord responded yes. And when he arrived, he was anointed as king, without any major conflict being described. When David learns that it was the men of Yabesh Gilead who rescued the body of Saul and gave him a proper burial, he sends messengers to them and gives them a great blessing, blessing them with the steadfast love of the Lord, because they were faithful to King Saul, but also saying that now David has been appointed as king over Judah. Although Judah quickly accepted David as their new king, most of the tribes of Israel did not do the same, and they instead followed Ishbosheth, son of Saul, who was made king by Abner, the commander of Saul's army, setting up for a civil war between David and Ishbosheth. The forces of David and Ishbosheth meet at Gibeon, in a battle that is described as fierce, but the men of David prevail. One of David's nephews, named Asahel, who is described as being as swift as a wild gazelle, chases after Abner, the commander of Ishbosheth's army. Abner did not want to kill Asahel, so he begged him to stop following him. But when he refused to do so, Abner eventually struck him in the stomach with the butt of a spear and killed him. The detail that Abner used the butt of his spear rather than the head is probably meant to show us that he still was not trying to kill Asahel, even though he ended up dying anyways. Asahel's brothers, Joab and Abishai, continued to pursue Abner, but they were unable to catch up with him, as Abner continued to march with his men straight through the night and eventually escaped across the Jordan. We are told that the war continues for a long time, but as it went on, David grew stronger while the house of Saul became weaker. We are also told that at this time, David had married multiple more women and had several children with them. One of the women that David is said to have married is Maacah, the daughter of Talmai, the king of Geshur. This detail is important because it shows us that David is not only falling victim to his lustful desires and desire to have as many children as possible so that he can secure an heir, but also that he's already falling for political marriages, getting married to somebody because of their status and title. I don't think it's a coincidence that the son of Maacah, Absalom, is the one who will go on to cause so many problems down the line. While the war was still ongoing, Abner began sleeping with a former concubine of Saul named Rizpah. Ishbosheth is upset by this, and he confronts Abner, but this confrontation makes Abner incredibly angry, saying that he is ungrateful for all that he has done to prevent David from defeating him. Because he felt unappreciated by Ishbosheth, Abner sent messengers to David requesting to defect to his side of the civil war. David says that he will accept Abner's defection to his side, but only if he brings Michal with him, David's first wife and one of the daughters of Saul. Not only was David trying to get Michal back after he had married 6 other women, he was also taking her from her new husband, Paltiel, who chased after her weeping the entire way as Abner brought Michal back to David. It's important to note that while the text doesn't explicitly say that what David is doing here is wrong, it's certainly not condoning his actions either. In fact, it's trying to do the exact opposite. It's placing these little breadcrumbs along the way that are leading you towards David's ultimate falter with Bathsheba. When Abner arrives, David holds a feast in his honor and makes a covenant with him that he would return to the tribes of Israel and convince them to follow David instead of Ishbosheth. But when Abner goes, Joab returns to Hebron, and when he finds out that David is attempting to make peace with Abner, he is furious. And so Joab lures Abner to a private place where he murders him by striking him in the stomach, probably intentionally trying to strike him in the same place that Abner had killed his brother Asahel. But David asserts that he did not break his peace with Abner because he did not desire to kill him, and he instead curses Joab and says that the blood of Abner's death is on Joab and his household. Once Ishbosheth and his forces learned of Abner's death, they were greatly dismayed, and 2 of his men, Rechab and Baanah, set out and they assassinated Ishbosheth in his own home in his own bed, stabbing him in the stomach and then removing his head. They brought the head to David, thinking that David would be happy with them for killing Ishbosheth, the man who sought to kill David. But David reacted to them the same way that he reacted to the Amalekite who brought the news of Saul's death. Except in this case, he said they were even more wicked, because at least the Amalekite was putting Saul out of his misery. But according to David, they had killed a righteous man in his own home and in his own bed. After this, all the tribes of Israel came to David at Hebron and anointed him as king over a united Israel and Judah. The first thing we are told that David does, now being the king over all Israel, is to go to the land of the Jebusites, to the city of Jerusalem, and to conquer it, turning it into his own city, and the new capital of the united Judah and Israel. After conquering the city, David had a house built for himself by carpenters and masons, as well as cedar trees from Tyre. As it was incredibly expensive to ship lumber from another nation, especially the notorious cedar trees of Tyre, this shows David's extraordinary wealth and opulence, and perhaps even that he was going too far in building up his own house. While the text does not explain explicitly what David's palace would have looked like, archaeologists in Jerusalem today have dug up a plot that they think could be David's house. Based on the dimensions found in the archaeological site, this is my take on what David's palace potentially could have looked like. Once the Philistines learned that David had been anointed king over Israel, they went out twice to try and defeat David and his army, but both times the Lord delivered them into David's hand. Sometime after this, David gathered men to take the Ark of the Covenant from the house of Abinadab and bring it to Jerusalem. But on its way to the city, Uzzah reached out and took hold of the ark, because the oxen that was pulling the cart had stumbled. But Uzzah was killed instantly. While this story is similar to the one in 1 Samuel chapter 6, in which some of the people of Beth Shemesh are killed by opening the Ark of the Covenant, it's also different in that the people in 1 Samuel appear to have acted willfully negligent in the way that they treated the Ark, whereas Uzzah appears to have made a genuine mistake, simply just trying to catch the Ark as the oxen had stumbled. I don't think I can give you a satisfying answer as to why the anger of the Lord was kindled against Uzzah, but I also think we're not alone in our confusion, as David himself is upset with God and confused as to why Uzzah had to die. And so David does not take the ark into Jerusalem, but instead sends it to the house of Obed-Edom. But later, when he realizes that Obed-Edom is thriving because of the presence of the ark, David takes it again into the city of Jerusalem. As the ark was brought into the city and to the place that David had pitched a tent for it, David continues to dance and leap and shout with joy for the ark of the Lord entering the city. Now, because of Michal's criticism of David that he shamelessly uncovered himself, many have interpreted this passage to imply that David was fully or at least partially naked during this event. Michal seems to be upset about what David is wearing for some reason or another, but we are told that David was wearing a linen ephod when he entered the city. Likely, Michal is trying to point out how unkingly David is acting by wearing the clothing of a priest rather than royal clothing, and by dancing in a manner that is unfit for a king. It's also possible that part of Michal's criticism comes from the fact that she's still angry with David for taking her from her husband to be with him again, so that she can simply be another one of his several wives and concubines that are trying to produce him an heir. Either way, David celebrates the entrance of the ark into the city by doing a series of burnt offerings and peace offerings, and distributing food and cakes to all the people of Israel. Now, as David continued to enjoy his great palace, he began to wonder why he dwells in a house of cedar, but the ark of God dwells in a tent. And so he went to speak to the prophet Nathan about this. But the prophet Nathan receives a word from the Lord that explains God's nature and why God has chosen to remain in a tent rather than in a temple. God explains that the purpose of the Lord dwelling in a tent rather than a temple is that the tent can go with the people of Israel wherever they have gone, from the days when they were in Egypt all the way through the wilderness, through the time of the judges. As the people of Israel have moved about and been nomadic, the Lord has always been with them, dwelling in the tabernacle, whereas a temple must remain where it is built. From this passage, we can begin to see that just as God originally wanted Israel to only be ruled by judges and not a permanent king or monarchy, God also desired that they would not have a temple in a specific place, but maintain a tabernacle that they could bring with them wherever they went. Nevertheless, God meets David where he is, and so the Lord makes a covenant with David, promising that one of his offspring would build a house for the Lord, and that God would establish the house of David on the throne as a kingdom forever. David responds with a prayer of great gratitude and thanksgiving, praising the Lord God for all the things he has done for Israel and for David personally. After this, David goes on to win many military victories over the Philistines, Moabites, Edomites, and others, all the while collecting a great amount of wealth in silver, gold, and bronze. But we are told that David dedicates all of this metal to the Lord. While David was ruling justly, he began to wonder if there was anyone left of Saul's household that he could show kindness to for the sake of his brother Jonathan. A servant named Ziba explained to David that he did know of one remaining son of Jonathan, a man named Mephibosheth, who was crippled in his feet. David brought Mephibosheth to him, and then he fell down on his face before him, giving him great kindness and honor, and promising to restore all the land of his father's house to his name. David also made a place for Mephibosheth at the king's table, so that he could eat as if he was one of the sons of the king himself, despite being a son of Saul and being lame in both his feet, something that would have been quite the taboo at the time. Now sometime later, the king of the Ammonites died, and Hanun reigned in his father's place. But David had been at peace with the Ammonites prior to Hanun taking over, so he sent a delegation to meet with them and console them after the loss of Nahash. But the princes of the Ammonites told Hanun that David was not sending comforters to honor his father, but instead they were to act as spies so that they could give information for David to overtake the city. And so Hanun took David's servants and shaved half of their beards off and cut their garments at the hips before sending them away, greatly ashamed. The Ammonites then went and hired mercenaries from a few Syrian kings before going up to battle against Israel. Joab was David's main commander, and he sent some of the men with Abishai, his brother, to go up against the Ammonites, and kept the best men with him to go against the Syrians. Joab struck the Syrian army, forcing them to flee, and when the Ammonites saw that the Syrians fled, they left as well. But the Syrians began to gather themselves back together on the other side of the Euphrates. And when David heard that their new group was commanded by Hadadezer, he went out himself and gathered all Israel to cross the Jordan and attack the Syrians. David defeated the Syrians convincingly, so much so that they were afraid to side with the Ammonites again in the future. So far, David's reign had been going incredibly well. He had won many battles, expanded Israel's territory, and brought great wealth back to Israel and Jerusalem. Not only has he had great military victories and wealth, but he's also been described as giving justice and equity to all his people, restoring Mephibosheth, and bringing the Ark of the Covenant into the city of Jerusalem. But despite all of David's success and apparent satisfaction with most of the things that he has, the one thing he never seems to be able to satisfy is his lust for women. One late afternoon, as David was walking about on the roof of his house, he saw a woman bathing and saw that she was very beautiful. And so David inquired about the woman and learned that she was the wife of Uriah the Hittite. But David did not care about this and sent messengers to take her and bring her to him. After sleeping with her, she went back to her house and conceived, and then she sent messengers to David, telling him that she was pregnant. David was trying to concoct a plan to make this whole mess go away, so he sent word to Joab to have Uriah return to Jerusalem from the field of battle. David hoped that if Uriah returned and slept with his wife Bathsheba, he would be able to pass off the baby as Uriah's rather than his own. They didn't have paternity tests back then. But this plan failed, because Uriah, being a man of honor, refused to go live in comfort and stay in his home and sleep with his wife, while his men were out in the battlefield fighting against the Ammonites. And so David tried a second time by bringing Uriah to a feast and getting him as drunk as he could, hoping that then he would go back and lay with his wife. But even still, he refused to go back to his home. Realizing that he can't pass off the baby as Uriah's, David comes up with a new plan. He writes a letter to Joab, instructing him to put Uriah at the forefront of the conflict, where the hardest fighting is going on, and then draw the other troops back so that he will be struck down and die. Joab does as David instructs, puts Uriah at the front of the conflict, and he is killed as David intended. After Bathsheba learns of Uriah's death, she goes through a period of lamentation and mourning. And when her mourning is complete, David brings her into his house and forces her to become his wife. David thought that he was out of the woods and that he had gotten away with his grave injustice. But the Lord was greatly displeased for David for the wicked deeds he had done. Not only had David committed adultery, but in his attempts to cover up his sins, he had lied and committed murder. Uriah, who was a Hittite, not an Israelite, had remained more faithful to the Lord God of Israel than David, the king over Israel. And so the Lord sent the prophet Nathan to David, who told him a story of two men in a city, one that was rich and one that was poor. The rich man had many flocks and herds, but the poor man had nothing except one little lamb. The poor man had brought up the lamb since it was born, and it grew with him and his children. And he gave to the lamb from his own food and drink, and he would let the lamb lay against his own chest. Nathan says that the lamb was like a daughter to the poor man, for he loved her so greatly. But when a traveler came into town to visit the rich man, he was unwilling to take from his own flock to prepare a meal for his guest. So he stole the lamb from the poor man and used that to prepare a meal for his guest instead. And so David's anger was kindled against this man, saying, "As sure as the Lord lives, this man deserves to die, and that he must restore the lamb fourfold because of the evil thing he has done." But then Nathan says to David, "You are that man. For I delivered you out of the hand of Saul and made you king over all of Israel, giving you all that you could ever ask for, and I would have given you even more if you had asked for it. But you have done what is evil in the sight of the Lord, and struck down Uriah the Hittite with the sword of the Ammonites, and taken his wife to be your own." Nathan prophesies that it is because of this great evil that contention will rise out of David's own house and come against him. After hearing this rebuke from Nathan, David repented and begged for forgiveness from the Lord God. And Nathan instructed David that he would not die from this sin, but the child that was conceived between him and Bathsheba will not survive because of his great sin. David prays and fasts for days, hoping that the Lord will relent and save his child from the illness. But once the child passes, David washes himself, changes his clothes, and goes to the house of the Lord to worship. Some of David's servants asked him why he was acting like a mourner while the child was still alive. But he went back to eating and doing things normally once the child had already passed. David explains to the servants that he was seeking the graciousness of the Lord God, that the child may live. But now that he is gone, why should he bother fasting? Nothing he can do can bring the child back. In their grief, David goes to comfort Bathsheba, and she ends up conceiving and bearing another son, whose name is Solomon. And so after these things, Joab sent messengers to David, saying that he had nearly captured the city of Rabbah from the Ammonites, and asking him to come out and finish the final push, to which David did, ending the siege that had been going on during all of these events. From this point forward, things begin to go downhill very quickly. One of David's sons, named Amnon, falls in love with one of his half-sisters named Tamar. Amnon pretends to be sick and requests that Tamar take care of him while he gets better. But while she is taking care of him, he requests that she come and lie with him. Tamar begs Amnon not to do such a detestable thing, but he overpowers her and violates her. Amnon then sends her away in a manner that would shame her even more within the cultural context of the time. Absalom, Tamar's full brother, brings her into his house and attempts to comfort and care for her to the best of his abilities, but he does not do anything to Amnon immediately. 2 full years later, Absalom gets his chance at revenge. He gathers all the sons of David together, and while Amnon is merry with wine, he strikes and kills him. And after Absalom had his revenge, he fled Israel and went back to Geshur, to the house of his mother's people. And David was heartbroken, for he longed to go out after Absalom, but he did not. Now Joab knew that David wanted Absalom back, but that he wouldn't go do it. So he concocted a plan to send a fake mourner to go convince David that Absalom should return. Joab's plan worked, and David had Absalom brought back to Jerusalem, but he had him live in a separate house, and for 2 years he did not interact with David. But Absalom eventually got tired of this game, and so he said that he would go before the king, and if David found any fault in him, then he could put him to death, but if not, they would be reconciled. And so Absalom came before the king and bowed himself on his face before David. And David kissed Absalom. At least for now, they were reconciled. But over time, Absalom began to desire the throne. He began to say, "Oh, that I were judge in the land. Then every man with a dispute or cause might come to me, and I would give him justice." And so Absalom asked David if he could go to Hebron to give a sacrifice there. But while he was there, he began to gather people to his conspiracy. And when David learned that the people were beginning to turn against him and side with Absalom, he gathered those that were loyal to him and fled to the Mount of Olives, weeping as he went. David leaves the Ark of the Covenant behind rather than taking it with him, proclaiming that if the Lord is still on his side, then he will be brought back to Jerusalem, and he will see the Ark and its dwelling place once again. As David continues past the summit of the Mount of Olives, he runs into Ziba, the servant of Mephibosheth. Ziba gives David donkeys, bread, raisins, wine, and summer fruits. When David questions Ziba as to where Mephibosheth is, Ziba answers that he has remained in the city and that he is attempting to get back the throne for himself. Because Mephibosheth has also betrayed David, he promises that all that once belonged to Mephibosheth will belong to Ziba. As David continued on his way to the city of Bahurim, in the land of the tribe of Benjamin, he came across a man from Saul's house named Shimei, the son of Gera, who cursed David. Abishai said that he would cut off the head of this man for his insolence towards the king David, but David said to leave him alone, for his own son sought after his life. If he was already cursed within his own household, how much more could a curse from the household of Saul really do? And so David continued on, ignoring Shimei, even though he continued to curse him and throw stones at him as he went. Meanwhile, Absalom entered Jerusalem triumphantly, and many of them there accepted him, at least on the surface, including Hushai the Archite, David's friend, who greeted Absalom, saying, "Long live the king," and said that his loyalty was to whoever the Lord chose to be over Israel. Now Ahithophel said that Absalom should choose 12,000 men, and that he would go after David immediately. But Absalom said that he wanted to hear from Hushai the Archite also. But Hushai the Archite said that he should wait and gather a massive force to himself before going out to try and pursue David. Absalom follows the counsel of Hushai the Archite rather than that of Ahithophel, even though Ahithophel's counsel was the better counsel, because the Lord had ordained that Absalom be defeated. Hushai the Archite not only helped David by giving Absalom poor counsel, but he also sent word to David to warn him of the coming troops. Once David and his men had escaped across the Jordan, and Ahithophel realized that his wise counsel was not followed, he took a donkey and went back to his home city, where he set his house in order and then hanged himself. Absalom continued to pursue David, but he received help from the Ammonites and the Gileadites on the other side of the Jordan. David mustered his men and put them under the command of Abishai, Joab, and Ittai the Gittite. He had planned to go out to battle against them himself as well, but his troops convinced him that that was not a good idea. David remained behind, but he asked his commanders to deal gently with Absalom, because despite everything that had happened, David still loved Absalom as he was his son, and perhaps he still believed there could be some chance of reconciliation. And so the two armies met and had a fierce battle in the forest of Ephraim. But the servants of David prevailed, and it is said that the forest itself devoured more people that day than the sword. And somehow Absalom got knocked off of his mule and stuck in a tree, where one of the soldiers refused to kill Absalom because of the command of David. But when Joab found out about it, he killed Absalom himself with 3 javelins into the heart of Absalom. And then for good measure, Joab's armor-bearers surrounded Absalom and struck him. And then Joab and his troops took Absalom and threw him into a great pit in the forest, where they covered him with stones. When David hears about Absalom's fate, he cries out in his grief and says that he wishes he would have been killed rather than Absalom. But Joab rebukes David, saying that he has brought shame upon his own soldiers by weeping even though they were victorious, saying that he probably would have been happier had his son survived, yet all of his men had died. David listens to Joab's rebuke, and after pulling himself together, goes to speak kindly to his servants, as Joab suggested. With Absalom gone, David returned to Jerusalem to retake the throne, and many of his enemies who turned against him during Absalom's rebellion suddenly sought forgiveness from David. David chooses to forgive or pardon each of these people, not holding it against them that they had sided with Absalom, or just failed to go with David. But David's return to Jerusalem wasn't immediately triumphant, as there was a man who still sought the throne, Sheba. Sheba claimed that the men of Israel had no inheritance in David, and he withdrew with many of them. But the men of Judah, of David's tribe, remained loyal to him. And so David commanded Amasa to call together the men and pursue Sheba. But Amasa was being slow in his pursuit of Sheba, so Abishai and Joab went after him. When Joab had caught up to Amasa, he went up to him under the guise of a friendly greeting. But once he got up to him, he pulled out his sword and stabbed him in the gut, murdering him where he stood. The exact reason as to why Joab killed Amasa is not made explicit in the text, but there are multiple reasons why he may have done so. Amasa was David's nephew and a cousin to Absalom, who had been in charge of Absalom's army during the rebellion. Additionally, when David returned to Jerusalem, he put Amasa in charge and took Joab out of the senior command position. It's also possible that Joab interpreted Amasa's slowness to go after Sheba as a likelihood that he may be turning to side with Sheba in another rebellion. After all, he had sided with Absalom in the previous one. Either way, Joab pursued Sheba all the way to the city of Abel of Beth-Maachah, where he began to besiege the city. While Joab and his men were attempting to breach the city, a wise woman called down to him and asked why he was attacking his fellow Israelites, to which he responded that he only sought Sheba, the man who was attempting to rebel against David. And so the woman went to go tell everybody that if they just gave over Sheba, then the city would be spared, to which they agreed, and they chopped off Sheba's head and threw it over the wall to Joab. So Joab blew the horn, and all his men returned to Jerusalem. But even with the rebellions dealt with, David continued to struggle for much of the rest of his kingship, dealing with a famine caused by a blood guilt with the Gibeonites, and continued war against the Philistines. Then we are given a song of David's deliverance, one that thematically ties together all the perils that David has faced and the Lord has delivered him from. The song is almost the same as Psalm 18 from the book of Psalms, with a few minor word changes. The theme of the poem can be summed up in its first few lines. The Lord is my rock and my fortress and my deliverer, my God, my rock, in whom I take refuge, my shield, and the horn of my salvation. Then we are given the final words of David, in which he says that one who rules with the fear of God has the Spirit of the Lord on them, but one who turns away from God will lead the people to destruction. The remainder of the chapter lists the names of David's mighty men and explains some of their deeds. In the final chapter, David sins against God by holding a census. While it's not made explicitly clear what was wrong with David's census in order to make it sinful, there are a couple of things that could have been wrong with it that we can infer. First, we see that Joab protests when David asks him to do the census, meaning something about this census Joab could tell was wrong. Joab warned David not to go through with it, but he forced Joab's hand anyways. Based on Joab's response that the Lord may add 100 times as many people as there were, it seems that Joab was affirming the Lord God's role in protecting Israel, whereas David was beginning to slip into wondering if his own military might could defend him and the rest of Israel. For some reason or another, what David did was a sin, and so God sent the prophet Gad to speak to David, and interestingly enough, he gave David a choice of what his punishment would be. David chose the punishment of pestilence, but after that, the prophet Gad came to David and told him to raise up an altar on the threshing floor of Araunah the Jebusite. When David first came to Araunah to get the land, he attempted to give it to David for free. But David asserted that he must purchase the land, because he could not give burnt offerings to the Lord God on land that had cost him nothing. And so David purchased the land for 50 shekels of silver and built an altar there to give offerings to the Lord God. And the plague went away from Israel. But the land would not just be used for David's altar, but following David's death, his son Solomon would build a temple for the Lord God on that very same land. I want to thank you all so much for watching. If you have any thoughts or questions, please feel free to leave them in the comments below. And if you'd like to see more of this series, please consider subscribing to the channel. Thanks again, and I hope to see you in the next one.